Before it was a chrome-clad legend of the open road, Peterbilt was a desperate solution to a mountain of mud. In the 1930s, the Pacific Northwest was a graveyard for ordinary machinery, and lumberman T.A. Peterman was tired of watching his profits sink into the forest floor. He didn't set out to create an American icon. He just needed a machine that could survive the timber without breaking its back. That singular problem produced the most recognized truck in history. But the story begins long before the red oval badge. It begins with the part most people skip: a transportation system that simply couldn't keep up. Peterman was not a truckman by trade. He was a timberman. He ran logging operations across the Pacific Northwest in the 30s. And the business of moving timber at that time was slow, expensive, and almost entirely dependent on infrastructure he did not control. Logs came out of the forest on skid roads, which were exactly what they sound like: rough paths cut through the trees, greased with animal fat or oil, used to drag timber down to water or rail. From there, the logs moved by river float or by railroad to the mill. Every step in that chain had a cost. Every step had a delay. And every step depended on someone else's equipment, someone else's schedule, or a river running at the right level. Rail was the dominant hauling method for serious timber operations. Logging railroads had been pushing into the forests since the 1880s, and by the time Peterman was running his operation, they were deeply embedded in how the industry worked. But rail had a fundamental limitation. You could only haul timber where the tracks went. Laying new track into fresh timber country was expensive and slow, and once the timber in that area was cut, the track was stranded. Water transport had the same problem in reverse. You needed the right watershed, the right season, and the right mill location. Neither system gave an operator the flexibility to move fast, cut where the timber was, and get out. Peterman saw trucks differently. A truck could go where you built a road, and you could build a road faster and cheaper than you could lay rail. The road did not have to be smooth. It did not have to be paved. It had to be passable, and it had to hold up under load. That was the calculation, and it was not a romantic one. It was a cost per thousand board feet calculation made by a man who needed his timber at the mill before the price moved. The trucks Peterman started with were not purpose-built logging trucks. They were primarily white trucks, along with other commercially available heavy-duty units. And a logging truck in that environment was fighting forces a normal road truck rarely saw. Climbing with a full load meant heat in the cooling system and strain through the driveline. Descending meant brakes that could fade fast if the truck was overweight or the road was loose. The frame twisted over ruts, stumps, and washouts that would have shaken a highway truck apart. Traction was never guaranteed, and once a load started shifting on a grade, the truck could stop being a machine and start becoming a problem. That was the world Peterman was modifying for. He didn't need trucks that looked strong on paper. He needed trucks that could survive repeated punishment in the field. Peterman's crews adapted them for timber work. That meant reinforcing the frames, upgrading the axles, and building trucks for loads and roads far beyond normal highway work. Peterman's modifications were not cosmetic. They were survival engineering. Stronger hauling capacity meant fewer trips per load. Fewer trips meant lower fuel cost, lower labor cost, and less wear on the road itself. Every mechanical improvement had a direct dollar value attached to it. And the trucks worked. They worked well enough that Peterman started to see something beyond his own operation. He was not just solving his hauling problem, he was demonstrating that trucks could compete with rail in many timber operations. Other operators were watching. The demand for capable, purpose-built logging trucks was real, and nobody was building them at scale for that specific application. That's when Peterman started thinking about manufacturing. In 1938, he got his opportunity. Fay-Joel Motors, a truck and bus manufacturer based in Oakland, California, was in financial trouble. Fay-Joel had a long history in the industry. The company had been building trucks and buses since the early 20s and had produced some genuinely innovative vehicles, including early articulated buses and heavy-duty trucks. But by the late 30s, the company was struggling and its assets were available. Peterman bought the Oakland plant and Fay-Joel's remaining inventory and equipment for a relatively modest sum. For that, he got a factory, tooling, parts stock, and the foundation of a truck manufacturing operation. This was not a cautious move. Peterman was a timber operator, not a manufacturer. He was buying into an industry he had only experienced from the customer side, but he had spent years modifying trucks for hard use, and he understood what those trucks needed to do better than most of the people who had been building them. He renamed the company Peterbilt Motors, a name built from his own, and the idea of a machine built to work. Production began in 1939. Those early Peterbilt trucks were built for operators who needed working machines. The initial lineup was based on Fay Joel's existing designs, but Peterman's influence was immediate. The trucks were configured for heavy hauling. They were built with the kind of structural integrity that logging and construction work demanded, and they were designed to be serviced in the field, because a truck that could not be repaired on a remote job site was a liability. The early Peterbilts used both cab-over and long hood conventional configurations depending on the application. The long hood layout, which placed the engine ahead of the cab, was particularly important for heavy-duty work because it gave mechanics direct access to the engine without climbing into the cab or removing major components. On a logging road or a construction site, that access mattered. Cab-overs solved length restrictions, but before widespread tilt cab designs, engine access was often more complex. The engines in those early trucks were large displacement gasoline and diesel units from suppliers including Cummins, Hall Scott, and Waukesha. Peterbilt was not building its own power plants. It was sourcing the best available engines and building trucks around them. That approach gave operators flexibility. You could spec a truck with the engine that matched your fuel supply, your terrain, and your maintenance capability. The war years changed the production picture significantly. Military contracts pulled manufacturing capacity across the entire industry, and Peterbilt was no exception. The company built trucks for the war effort, which meant volume production under tight specifications. That experience with volume and consistency would matter later. Peterman died in 1944, just 5 years after Peterbilt began production. He was only 45 years old. He had taken a struggling Oakland plant and turned it into a functioning truck manufacturer with a real customer base and a clear identity. And he did not live to see what it became. His widow, Ida Peterman, took over the company after his death. She ran it for 3 years. In 1947, she sold Peterbilt to a group of employees and investors who took a significant risk to keep the company going. The company stayed in Oakland and kept building trucks. The post-war period was when Peterbilt's design identity started to sharpen. The American trucking industry was expanding rapidly. The interstate highway system was still a decade away, but freight was moving by road in volumes that would have been unimaginable before the war. Operators needed trucks that could handle long-haul work, not just logging roads and construction sites. Peterbilt responded with aluminum. The decision to use aluminum in cab construction was not a styling choice. It was a weight decision with direct operational consequences. A conventional steel cab on a heavy-duty truck added significant weight to the front axle. That weight counted against the truck's legal payload capacity. Every pound you saved in the cab was a pound you could add to the load. Aluminum cabs were lighter. They were also more resistant to corrosion than steel, which mattered in the Pacific Northwest, in coastal operations, and anywhere trucks were exposed to salt, moisture, and the kind of chemical environment that ate steel over time. But an aluminum cab dented differently than steel, and it repaired differently, but it lasted. Peterbilt became one of the companies most closely associated with aluminum cab construction at a time when steel still dominated much of the industry. That reputation for lightweight, durable construction was not marketing language. It was a spec sheet advantage that operators could measure in payload and maintenance cost. The trucks were also getting longer in the hood. The long-nose conventional layout that Peterbilt favored gave the trucks a visual presence that was unmistakable. A long hood meant a long engine bay. A long engine bay meant room for large displacement engines, room for cooling systems that could handle sustained high-load operation, and room for mechanics to work without removing the cab. That layout also meant the driver sat back from the front axle. In a rough road environment, that mattered for ride quality and for visibility on grades and curves. The driver could see the road ahead without the front wheels being directly underfoot. By the early 50s, Peterbilt was building trucks that looked different from most of what was on the road. The proportions were distinctive. The lines were clean without being decorative. These were working machines shaped by operators who knew what they needed. In 1953, Peterbilt introduced the red oval badge. It was a simple piece of identification, but it became one of the most recognized emblems in the industry. The oval went on the hood of every Peterbilt, and over time it became shorthand for a specific kind of truck. Not the cheapest truck, not the most common, the truck that a driver chose when the choice mattered. In 1954, Peterbilt introduced the design development that would define its visual identity for decades. The needle-nose styling, which sharpened the front of the hood into a more tapered, pointed profile, was not purely aesthetic. The shape helped accommodate the narrow radiator needed for certain engine configurations, while also giving the hood a cleaner, more streamlined appearance. And it created a silhouette that was immediately identifiable at a distance. For truckers, the needle nose was more than styling. It made the truck instantly recognizable, and recognition matters in a business where drivers attach meaning to the machine as much as the spec sheet. Peterbilt was becoming a truck you could identify at a distance and respect before it ever pulled into the yard. The 281 and 351 were closely related models offered with a range of gasoline and diesel engines. Both used the long hood layout and could be spec'd with power from suppliers such as Cummins, Caterpillar, and Detroit Diesel. Both were built with the aluminum construction that had become a Peterbilt signature. What made those trucks matter was not just that they looked right. It was that the layout gave operators real advantages they could feel on the road and in the shop. A long hood conventional gave you room for big engines, room for cooling, and room to work when something went wrong. That mattered in an era when a truck might be hundreds of miles from a dealer and the driver or mechanic had to solve the problem with the hood open and tools on the ground. The aluminum cab helped keep weight down without giving up durability, which meant more of the legal gross weight could go to payload instead of truck structure. The set forward front axle also gave the truck the stance that drivers came to associate with Peterbilt. But it was not just about stance. It helped stretch the wheelbase, balance the proportions of the truck, and support the long hood package that operators wanted for engine access and heavy-duty use. The result was a machine that felt purpose-built. You could spec it for the work, reach the engine without fighting the cab, and run a truck that looked sharp without sacrificing function. That combination mattered to owner-operators in a way a spec sheet alone never could. A fleet manager might see numbers. A driver saw a truck he would have to live with every day, maintain in the real world, and trust under load. The 351 in particular became a benchmark. It was a serious long-haul truck at a time when the American highway system was expanding and freight operators needed machines that could run hard miles without breaking down in the middle of nowhere. The 351 could do that. It had the structural integrity, the engine options, and the serviceability that long-haul work demanded. And drivers noticed. Owner-operators started choosing Peterbilts because the trucks combined hard-use capability with an identity that felt personal. They worked, they lasted, and they looked like they belonged to someone who cared about the machine. In 1958, Peterbilt was acquired by PACCAR, the Washington-based manufacturer that already owned Kenworth and stepped in at a moment when Peterbilt needed a stable future. The acquisition gave Peterbilt access to PACCAR's engineering resources, purchasing scale, and financial stability. It also raised an obvious question about whether Peterbilt would retain its identity under a corporate parent. The answer, over the following decades, was yes. PACCAR kept Peterbilt and Kenworth as distinct brands with shared engineering resources, but different identities, design philosophies, and styling. Peterbilt stayed in California. It kept building long hood conventionals. It kept using aluminum. It kept the red oval. The PACCAR acquisition did not flatten Peterbilt into a generic product line. It gave the brand the infrastructure to survive and grow without losing what made it distinct. That survival mattered. The trucking industry went through enormous changes in the decades after 1958. Emissions regulations reshaped engine design. Safety standards changed cab construction. The interstate highway system created a new operating environment that demanded different performance characteristics than the logging roads and early highways where Peterbilt had built its reputation. Peterbilt adapted to all of it. The Model 359, introduced in 1967, became one of the most iconic trucks the company ever built. It was a long hood conventional with a set forward front axle, a wide stance, and proportions that looked like the truck had been designed to be driven hard and looked at while doing it. The 359 stayed in production until 1987. 20 years. In an industry that cycled through models constantly, That kind of production run was a statement about how well the truck worked and how much operators trusted it. The 359 was the truck that appeared in films, on album covers, and became one of the trucks that defined the American image of a big rig. It was the truck that made Peterbilt a cultural object as well as a working machine. But it was still, underneath all of that, a truck built on the principles that T.A. Peterman had established in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. He never saw the red oval or the needle nose. He never saw his name on the door of a truck that a driver saved up years to buy.